G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. Today we'll be looking at the dispensations of God, and I pray that it will be of benefit to you and it will help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Tonight we're looking at the dispensations of God, or welcome. We're looking at the dispensations of God. I've broken it down into two parts because it was too much to handle in one hit. So tonight we'll look at the first three dispensations. There are, so what we're going to look at here. One key to understanding the scriptures is to rightly divide the word of truth. And we do know that there are a number of different ways the Bible can be divided in order to understand the parts well, as the whole. Now, one of those ways is by means of the dispensations, which are contained in the scriptures. What's the definition of a dispensation? Well, to understand exactly what a dispensation is, there are two major major words in the Greek language from which the concept of dispensation comes. The first Greek word is oikonomia, from which our English word ecumenical is derived, and that means to divide or to apportion or to administer or to manage the affairs of an inhabited house. So it's how you run your household, basically. You will run your household differently when you have a 2-year-old child than when you do when you have grown adult children. The central idea with this oikonomia is managing or administering the affairs of a household. And so this word itself doesn't tell us time. It doesn't give us a concept of time. But the other Greek word, which is aion, which means age, that emphasizes the dispensation, how you manage your household in its element of time. And so on one hand, what we have is the term dispensation refers to a specific way by which God administers his program and his will in the world. And on the other hand, it covers a period of time. So as to its content and its meaning, a dispensation is a stewardship, it's a responsibility, or it's an administration. As to time, it is an age, because every dispensation that we're going to look at, it covers a period of time. And what we will find is that within each dispensation, God administers his economy, his rule, his authority, and his program in some different way than the previous dispensation. So dispensations are separate periods of time in which God dispenses his will in a specific and unique way. And it's based upon a covenant upon which a particular dispensation is founded. Now, last time we met, we did the covenants. So now tonight we're doing the dispensations which cover those covenants. Now, there are facets to dispensation, various facets, and there are actually 7 specific elements or facets which are involved in each dispensation. And first up, what we have is that each dispensation has one or more names, and those names will show what the basic rule of life was for that particular dispensation. The second thing we'll find is that each dispensation has a chief person to whom special revelation is given. And then the third thing we'll find is that each dispensation provides a responsibility to man, because each dispensation begins with some new revelation which requires a human response. So that's the first 3. The fourth we have is that in every dispensation there is a specific test. And then the fifth thing is, following that specific tests, comes a specific failure. And then the sixth thing we have is that with the failure, there is now a judgment that then brings that dispensation to an end. And then the seventh thing we find with these dispensations is that each dispensation has something that always characterizes divine grace. In every dispensation, there is an element of divine grace. In every dispensation, there's a judgment, but in every dispensation, we do have an element of God's divine grace. The first dispensation that we're going to look at is the dispensation of innocence or freedom, and that we find in Genesis, from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 to chapter 3, verse 8. So what we see here is, as we said before, the most common way to divide the Bible is by dispensations, and the dispensations, which we said are based upon a specific covenant, and knowledge of these covenants will help you and I to rightly divide the word of truth. And Timothy, 2 Timothy tells us that, 2 Timothy 2:15, but Paul tells Timothy that. Okay, so in this first dispensation, the dispensation of innocence or freedom, that's the two names we have. We have the dispensation of innocence or the dispensation of freedom. And the names are simply used to emphasize different aspects of this dispensation. The first name, which is innocence, it emphasizes the fact that Adam and Eve, because this is the very first dispensation, Adam and Eve were innocent of any sin or sin nature at this particular time. And theologically, their state is called unconfirmed creaturely holiness. Big words. Unconfirmed creaturely holiness. They were creatures, they were holy, but their holiness has been unconfirmed, simply because they were created holy. But the holiness of Adam and Eve had not yet been confirmed because they had not yet been tested as to whether they're going to stay true to the word of the Lord, as to whether they're going to be obedient to God. And then the second name, freedom, emphasizes the fact that both Adam and Eve in this dispensation were free from sin. They were not yet slaves to sin. They had not yet sinned. So this first one is the dispensation of innocence or freedom. Innocence because Adam and Eve had not sinned. Freedom because they're not yet enslaved to sin because they have not sinned. Now the chief person, as you can guess, he's Adam. God revealed his will, and God revealed his divine economy and divine administration through the person of Adam. Now, what was his responsibility, or what was man's responsibility under this dispensation? Well, during this dispensation of innocence or freedom, Adam and Eve's responsibility, or man's responsibility, was to the Edenic covenant. And this was the covenant that God had made with Adam and Eve in the beginning. And the basic content of the Edenic covenant contained two aspects to it. First of all, the covenant, they were responsible to the earth, and they're responsible to the Garden of Eden. Concerning the earth, they were responsible to subdue it, to replenish it, to multiply on the earth, and to take control of it in general. Concerning the garden, they were responsible to till the garden. Now, the Edenic covenant, this is a quick burst of what we did last time. The provisions of the Edenic covenant regarding the earth. First up, they were to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And we find that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Secondly, they were to subdue the earth, Genesis 1, verse 28. Then they were to have dominion over all living things, Genesis 1, 28. And back then, man's diet was vegetarian. And we see that in Genesis 1, 29 to 30 and Genesis chapter 2, verse 16. Now that was in regard to the earth. In regard to the garden, they had to dress and keep the Garden of Eden, and we find that in Genesis 2 verse 15. And in the Edenic covenant, there was a stipulation that they were forbidden to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's Genesis 2 verse 17. And then God gave them the penalty for disobedience. And the penalty for disobedience, if they ate from that tree, was spiritual death. And again, we find that in chapter 2, verse 17. So that was the covenant, and the dispensation based around that covenant was this dispensation of innocence or freedom. Now, what was man's specific test? The specific test of this dispensation was the test concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was a test to see if Adam and Eve would obey the most minimal demand of the divine will. They had absolute authority over the entire planet. As far as the Garden of Eden itself was concerned, they had absolute authority over it, and they had the right to eat of every single tree in that garden, including the tree of life. So the test was a very basic test. If Adam and Eve had passed that test, their state would have changed from being unconfirmed holiness to confirmed creaturely holiness. What would be the result of that? Well, this means that they would have passed from the ability to sin to the ability not to sin, or better still, they would no longer have the ability to sin after their holiness was confirmed. So all they had not to do was do not eat from that one tree. That was it, nothing else. And if they hadn't, after a period of time, they would have been confirmed in their holiness, never able to sin again. And then we wouldn't be in the problem we're in today. Now, this was the same kind of test that all of the angels underwent when they were first created. All angels were created in unconfirmed creaturely holiness. And then came the test. Now, Satan was the first to fail the test, and he was followed by 1/3 of the entire angelic host. The 1/3 who failed the test are now totally corrupt. The 2/3 of the angels, they did pass the test, changing their state from unconfirmed creaturely holiness to confirmed creaturely holiness. And now they are no longer able to sin. They cannot sin. And the same thing would have happened, or would have been true for Adam and Eve. Had they passed this test, they would have been confirmed in creaturely holiness, just as the good angels, and would not have been able to sin anymore. And we would have been living without sin. Now, man's failure, unfortunately, Adam and Eve did fail the test. Why? Because they ate of the very tree from which they were forbidden to eat. And as a result, their creaturely holiness was not confirmed. And just as the fallen angels, they now were corrupted and became totally depraved in their nature. Now, when we speak about depravity, total depravity, we're not talking about the way we think about it today. Total depravity simply means that sin had touched every part of their being and every area of their human lives. They were totally corrupt in regard to sin. Now, man's judgment, remember, we have these 7 aspects. Judgment. The judgment in this dispensation was expulsion from the garden and the curse upon the earth. So the expulsion from the garden meant that they were now expelled to a place outside of the garden, and the tremendous environment which they had within the garden, that was no longer available to them. They would no longer be able to eat freely from every tree found in the garden, nor would they be able to eat from the tree of life. And instead of that, instead of having an easy working relationship with the land, so the labor was very easy and light, what happened now is the toilsome aspect of labor was added. Now it's hard work. Adam would now have to work the earth by the sweat of his brow in order to be able to eat. And also, the curse meant the earth would no longer be his friend, but now the earth is his enemy. As Adam would try to produce things from the earth, he would have a continual war with thorns and thistles. So weeds. But we have God's display of grace here, and God's display of grace is seen in that at the same time as the expulsion from the garden and the cursing of the earth took place, God also promised a redeemer. Because in Genesis 3:15, God says here, he says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, this is talking to Satan, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So God's grace is demonstrated here in that God promised that a Messiah would someday come who would do two things. First of all, he would defeat the enemy of man, Satan. And he was the one who brought about the curse, the expulsion, and the fall of man through his temptation. And secondly, this one who would be the Messiah, he would be the one who would conquer the curse and would have the curse removed. Physical death, which was now a result of this fall of man, would eventually be overcome by the resurrection of that last Adam and by the ultimate resurrection of all people. So that's the first one. Now we're into the second one, the dispensation of conscience or self-determination. And we find this in Genesis chapter 3, verse 9 to Genesis chapter 8, verse 14. Again, we have two names. It's called the dispensation of conscience or the dispensation of self-determination. Now, the first name, conscience, emphasizes the principle by which God dispensed his economy. So conscience, man's conscience, was the way God governed mankind in this dispensation. And the name here comes from Romans chapter 2, verse 15, where Paul writing in Romans, he says, they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another, accusing or else excusing them. So man was now governed by his conscience. And this states here that God dealt with men for a period of time on the basis of their conscience until finally their conscience became so defiled and seared that it was no longer possible to continue governing God's economy in the world in this way. Now, the second name emphasizes the other side of the flip side of the coin of conscience, where man was now given the freedom to follow the dictates of his conscience. And his obligation was to follow through with what his conscience demanded, whether it accused him or excused him. If he followed his conscience, his self-determination would have led to holiness. But if he did not follow his conscience, or if his conscience was defiled, blackened or darkened or seared, which Paul talks about, then his self-determination would go in the opposite direction, where he'd be anything but holy. Now, again, the chief person in this one was Adam. He was the chief person in the first dispensation, which we can understand. He was the first man, but now he's the chief person in this one as well. Adam now received some new revelation after the first dispensation was finished. Now into a second dispensation, and he received some new revelation which now spelled out the principles and requirements of this new dispensation. And in this one, we have the Adamic covenant. So we had the first covenant we had was the Edenic covenant, and when that was broken, then God made a new covenant with Adam, and that was the Adamic covenant. And in that, it had four provisions, or four entities are involved. not four provisions, four entities are involved. First of all, we have the serpent, and we find this in Genesis 3:14, and we see that the serpent is cursed above all creatures. It's going to crawl on its belly, dust shall be his food. So we have that's Satan, that's the serpent. Now we have Satan in Genesis 3:15, and in that we see there's hatred between Satan and the woman, and that now culminates between Satan's seed, which is the Antichrist, and the woman's seed. Satan would bruise the heel of the woman's seed. The woman's seed will crush Satan's head. So that's the first two. Now the other 3 and 4, we have the woman in Genesis 3:16, and we have with her the multiplication of menstrual pain and conception. She would give birth in pain, and she'd have to be subject also to her husband. And then we have the man in Genesis 3:17 to 19. And here we have Adam. He's the one who's held responsible. The earth was cursed. Diet continues to be vegetarian, can't eat meat as yet. Work is characterized by hard labor, and physical death was now introduced. Now, what was man's responsibility? This responsibility here was obedience to this Adamic covenant. And this is found in Genesis chapter 3. Among the requirements of the Adamic covenant were the responsibility of the wife to be in subjection to her husband. And then we have the working of the land in toil and sweat of his brow, means it was hard work. And then we have the concept of physical death and a number of other things. Now, man was held responsible to the Adamic covenant, and the key element in this responsibility was faith in the promised Redeemer. And contained within the scope of this covenant, was the promise of Genesis 3:15, in which God told Satan, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed, her seed. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. So what this verse did was, this verse promised us, or promised them, that a time was coming when a human descendant of the same woman that Satan had tempted, bringing about the fall of man, would someday conquer Satan and crush his head. The promise was that the Messiah would be after the seed of the woman. Now, if you see this, you got to see the specific thing here. It's after the seed of the woman. Now, this goes contrary to all the normal biblical pattern. And normally in the Bible, we find that a man's line was traced through the genealogy of the father, never the mother. It was always through the seed of the male, not the seed of the female. That is why all the genealogies in Scripture always contain the male line, and females are seldom mentioned in them. In the case of Messiah, it was going to be different, because the Messiah would be reckoned after the seed of the woman. Genesis 3:15 didn't tell him how that was going to happen. In fact, this is not explained until Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, where there Isaiah prophesied that when the Messiah would be born, he would be born of a virgin. And the clear reason why the Messiah would have to be reckoned after the seed of the woman was that he would not have a human father. So man's responsibility was to believe that promise, the promise of the seed. And someday, the seed of the woman, the Messiah, would come and redeem them from the prince of this world, Satan. Although in the previous dispensation and covenant, God gave the authority over this earth to man, what happened was Adam fell, he lost the authority, and Satan actually usurped the authority from man, and therefore now, even in the New Testament, Satan is called the prince of this world, and we find that in John chapter 12, verse 31, and he's also called the God of this age that we're currently in, which we find in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. Now, what was man's test? The specific test in this dispensation of conscience was twofold. First of all, it was obedience to the dictates of conscience in the knowledge of good and evil. And secondly, when there was failure, they were to offer a proper and acceptable blood sacrifice. And we can glean this from two passages in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 21, it says, "And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them." Remember, God had to kill an animal to make those garments of skin to clothe them. So blood was shed. And in Genesis 4, verse 4, where we see Cain and Abel. Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. So what we learn from this is there had to be an animal sacrifice for one when he failed in disobedience. So the test involved man's obedience, two things. It involves man's obedience to the dictates of conscience in the knowledge of good and evil, and then man's failure, man's response to failure by a proper and acceptable sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. From Genesis chapter 3, we see that one can only approach God on the basis of shed blood. Now, man's failure we see here in this second dispensation was seen as early as the case of Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3, because it says, "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground." Cain failed to bring a proper blood sacrifice and thought he could come to God on his own terms, rather than on the terms that God had ordained. And then we see in Genesis chapter 4, verse 8, Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So failure in this second dispensation was seen in the first act of murder when Cain murdered his brother Abel. But failure is also seen in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, when it says there that Jehovah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this speaks here of open violence, corruption, widespread evil, and a continuous evil desire in the heart and the purpose of man. So what we see here is that the heart of man was for the purpose of evil continually. So man's judgment, the judgment in this dispensation was the worldwide flood. And that was to bring humanity to an end with the exception of one family. So with the worldwide flood, this dispensation now comes to an end. Humanity had become so evil to the point that they could no longer follow their conscience. Their conscience was so darkened and degenerate that it was no longer a reliable guide whatsoever. Now here's God's display of grace again. And the element of grace in this dispensation is seen in the salvation of Enoch. It was also seen in the salvation of Noah and his family. All these people found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Remember, Enoch walked with the Lord and was not. He just went. And then we have Noah in the ark. Now we come to the third dispensation, which is the dispensation of civil government. And now we find this in Genesis 8, verse 15 to Genesis 11, verse 32. The names, this is simple name, it's the dispensation of civil government. It has that name because it is with this particular dispensation now that man is given the right of life and death. And he's given the authority to rule others. And the concept of ruling and having power to execute or not to execute contains within it the concepts of human government. And this principle is in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, where it says, "Whoso sheds man's blood, by him shall his blood be shed." So man is now given the authority to execute the murderer, and this carries with it the concept of rule, authority, and government. Chief person in this dispensation was Noah. He received new and specific divine revelation that told him exactly how the divine economy in this dispensation of God would be run. Now, what's man's responsibility? Concerning the human responsibility in this dispensation, it was obedience to the Noahic covenant of Genesis 9. So far, we've seen that every dispensation has its own covenant, or every covenant has its own dispensation. Now, contained within the scope of the Noahic covenant was that man must replenish and fill the earth in light of the destruction of humanity by the flood. We see this in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. Also, it concerns what man was allowed to eat. Until this event, man was allowed to eat only vegetables. Man was to be vegetarian in the two preceding dispensations. Now, from this point on, man was now allowed to go beyond the limit of vegetables and was allowed to eat any kind of meat that he chose. We see this in Genesis 9, verse 3. Also, what we see here is that there's no dietary limitations whatsoever placed upon man under the Noahic covenant. But we also see that the fear of man was now put into the animals, and man was to dominate them. Well, they're now fearful because they now hunted for food. Also, we see here another stipulation of the Noahic covenant was it was forbidden to eat blood. We see that in chapter 9, verse 4 of Genesis. Something else, the Noahic covenant was to establish human government. And God was going to dispense or govern his economy through human government. And we see that in chapter 9, verses 5 to 6. Now, man was responsible to obey human government, which would have the authority to enforce its rules and regulations to the point of execution when one killed another person. This one, in this dispensation, or in this covenant, what we had was the rainbow was given as a sign or a token of the Noahic covenant, and that simply promised that God would never again destroy the earth with a flood. And we see that in chapter 9, verses 8 to 11 of Genesis. Now, what was man's test? The specific test of the third dispensation was that man was to rule properly and man was to spread out. But they were not to be under only one government in one place. God demanded that they disperse all over the earth. Man's failure, the failure was seen in what man tried to do in the Tower of Babel or Babel in Genesis 11. They tried to stay together using the Tower of Babel as a point of contact, as a center of staying together. The Tower of Babel would function both literally and symbolically. As a literal thing, the Tower of Babel was an attempt to build a high tower for the purpose of studying the stars. It was to reach onto heaven. In fact, the very name Babylon in Hebrew, which is Babel, means the gate of God. So they were not trying to build a tower that would reach to God's heaven itself. Rather, it was a tower that was high enough to give good visibility for the study of the stars. And this was not for the sake of astronomy, but for the sake of astrology, or the signs of the zodiac. And the study of astrology now meant it was a repudiation of God's control as the ultimate and only creator. Astrology was a repudiation of the worship of the one God. So man now began to move into polytheism and all kinds of other things as well. So this act marks the beginnings of false religion and idolatry. And that is why we find in Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, there it refers to Babylon as the mother of the harlots, the mother of all false religious systems. So the building of this tower expressed the people's desire for a new religion. And behind all of these things lay demonism. And that is where the failure was clearly seen. That was the physical purpose of the Tower of Babel. Now, what was the symbolic purpose? The symbolic purpose was to deliberately disobey God's command to spread all over the world. So the purpose of the Tower of Babel was to serve as a center of attraction. It was to keep humanity together so that they would not spread out and begin to lose contact among themselves. So basically, their intent here was not to move outside of the Babylonian area, which lies between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. So instead of using government properly, they tried to build empires, as the story of Nimrod points out. It says, Nimrod was a mighty hunter, but he was also the first empire builder. And in fact, Nimrod later became Marduk, or as it appears elsewhere in the scriptures, Merodach, who was the chief god of Babylon. So he set himself up as the El Numero Uno. So instead of seeing each kingdom as being independent, he tried to unify all kingdoms under his authority. So rather than separate kingdoms as God had originally intended, the nature of empires is to try to consolidate them. Now, what's man's judgment? As a result of their attempt to rebel against God's commands and authority, God sent a judgment upon them. And we find this in Genesis chapter 11, verse 7, where God says, "Come, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So it was the confusion of tongues. One of the key elements in being able to stay together and live together is having a common language. And a common language tends to keep a certain segment of society, cohesively together in one area. And once there's a differentiation of language, you usually have wars. So in chapter 11, verse 8 of Genesis, so Jehovah scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. How did it all happen? What we see, for instance, is that the Germans, for instance, they tend to stay together in Germany. Why? Because they all speak the language. It keeps them together. The Italians in Italy. Same thing is true in any country. But when there's a difference in language within one country, it often leads to civil war, as in the various states of Europe, for instance, where one part of a nation spoke one language, another part spoke a different language. So with the lack of a common language, there is turmoil, confusion, conflict, and war. And by God causing the confusion of tongues, God accomplished a forced dispersion. He forced them to disperse. And now this doesn't mean that every human being at that point spoke a different language. That's not what it means. What might have happened, it could have been that, 5 people found out, that they were able to communicate by speaking the same language. So what they did was they said, "Oh, listen, we're going to shift away from this bunch. We can't understand them." And as a result, they would then move to a certain part of the world and speak whatever language they were speaking. And then, on the other hand, they might have 10 or 15 found themselves speaking the same language, and they too moved to another part of the world to separate themselves from those that they couldn't understand. And so they established their own people group, their own language. And this is the way that God accomplished his original intent, which was man was to spread throughout the entire world and replenish it. So he forced it. Now, what's God's display of grace here? Well, grace was displayed in the third dispensation in the way that God preserved his remnant. Now, the particular remnant that God preserved after the flood are the people whose names are listed after the Tower of Babel incident. And these names in Genesis 11 what they do is they trace the genealogy of Noah and Shem all the way down to Abraham, with whom God will bring about the next dispensation. So in chapter 11, verse 10 of Genesis, these are the generations of Shem. And then we find that Abraham comes out of Shem. So God did preserve a remnant, and they were followers of the one true God during that period of time. And God so maintained the seed line. Remember the seed from Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman in the remnant. The promise he made concerning the seed of the woman continued to be preserved in spite of the flood, in spite of the Tower of Babel. So God preserved this unique seed line through which the promise was going to be fulfilled. And that's the first 3 dispensations for this session. In the next session, we look at the other 4. Thank you for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it.